Well, good morning. Hey, welcome to our Kansas adventure. And we're really excited today. We have Trey Johnson with us from the Kansas Historical Society, and he's going to be talking about John Brown. I'm going to turn it over to you, Trey.
All right, awesome. Well, good morning, everyone, and happy Kansas Day to you. So today we're talking about this guy. Who is John Brown? Very, very complicated man that we often hear about a lot in Kansas with the most generic name ever, right? Like you could run into John Brown at like the grocery store. But John Brown, generic name aside, very unique person. So we are going to try to speed run through this today, talk about what made this guy tick and why we're still talking about him today. So to get an understanding of John Brown, we got to talk about the world that he lived in because it was a way different than our lives today. So slavery was the big thing with John Brown. John Brown was an abolitionist, meaning he wanted to end slavery. Um, so we got to talk about slavery, which is really tough to talk about. Before we were even the United States, when we were colonies, there were two forms of cheap labor that were kind of baked into our system. Indentured servants, who basically had a contract to work a plantation owner's land. After that, they were free to go. And enslaved people. Enslaved people had no contract. They were considered property for life and forced to work with the threat of violence from sunup to sundown, with no pay and no rights and no political representation at all. Um, and as we became the United States, this system of enslaved people being a form of cheap labor was baked into our government and our founding documents, even the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Um, so I won't go into all of these, but just kind of showing you that since the Declaration of Independence was signed into the Constitution all the way up until the Civil War, the North and the South are continually making a series of compromises to keep the nation together. Um, and the issue that's causing all this tension is slavery. Um, so you can kind of think of this as like a can being kicked down the road. So it's like, oh, here's this massive problem. Well, we'll worry about it again a little bit later. And then a little bit later shows up. Oh, we'll do something and then worry about it later. So these tensions only increase as we get closer and closer to the inevitable civil war. And us today, we know what's going to happen. But them at the time, they really didn't. There were a lot of different views on how slavery would eventually stop. And we know today that it included us going to war against our own country. But this is the life, the setting that John Brown is living in. So he's born in 1800, really before a lot of these tensions start ramping up. Um, that's the house that he was born into. They really quickly moved to Ohio, and his dad was an abolitionist as well, so he got a lot of that growing up. Their house was a safe house on the Underground Railroad, and it wasn't underground and it wasn't really a railroad, but the Road was essentially a series of routes and safe houses to have people that were escaping slavery stay and hide out. So they put a lot of risk on themselves to help these people escape. But it wasn't just John Brown's dad who instilled the idea that slavery was wrong. Um, when he was 12 years old, John Brown made friends with an enslaved kid, the same age as him, and he really looked up to this kid. He thought he was smarter than him, he was stronger. Um, and then one night he saw this little boy get beaten with a fire shovel by the slave owner. And John Brown is sitting there thinking, what the heck is going on? Like this kid is better than me, and he's subject to this awful behavior just because of the color of his skin. And this is something John Brown never forgets. It happens early in his life, and just a few years before he dies, he's writing about this incident and how it always stuck in his head. So one crucial component, if there's anything we take away here today, folks, it's that John Brown's religion completely shaped his whole identity and basically almost every decision that he made. So if you don't think about his faith, it's real easy to think that John Brown is kind of crazy. And you'll hear a lot of people say that, like John Brown's a madman. I mean, on the walls of the Capitol, tragic prelude, a gun and a Bible in his hand, he's screaming with a huge beard. He looks crazy. Um, but John Brown had a unique view of religion in that he believed truly that he himself was an instrument in the hands of God. So God was telling him what to do, and God created John Brown to bring an end to slavery. This is what John Brown truly believed. So his faith is always guiding him throughout his whole life. So there's some times that we're going to talk about where it's like, that was probably a really questionable decision that he made. Well, to him, he's thinking that, he's Samson bringing down the walls of the temple or Moses freeing the slaves. Like he has that idea in his head. So, at the age of 20, he gets married. His first wife, Diane, gives birth to 7 children. Um, she eventually dies of childbirth. While they're raising these children, John Brown's doing a couple different business operations. He's surveying land. He's raising cattle. He operates a tannery business that he also uses as a safe house on the Underground Railroad. So while he's doing this, an estimated 2,500 people he helps escape the institution of slavery. So he's doing this work throughout a lot of his life. Um, Eventually, his wife dies of childbirth. He remarries. She has 13 children. So not all of these children survive, unfortunately, but 7 plus 13, 20 kids. Like that's wild. So also a little bit of a different life than than today. But a big turning point happens, and this is when we can publicly pinpoint where John Brown dedicates his life to eradicating slavery. It was in church in November of 1837. He stands up before the congregation and says, quote, "Here before God, in the presence of these witnesses, from this time I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery." So he puts it all out there. And then things got worse. So this is a theme in John Brown's life, unfortunately. Lots of ups and downs, lots of highs and lows. So he is financially devastated in the Panic of 1837. He has at least 15 business failures, 21 lawsuits against him, and he has to declare bankruptcy. And for a man as proud as John Brown, this ruins him. This is the one of the lowest points of his life, um, including his leading up to his death. I mean, this is real bad for John Brown, and it really ruins his reputation. And this is something that people will point to about John Brown never being successful about anything because he had a rough go at it. To make matters worse, 3 of his kids die of dysentery. So yeah, not a great time for John Brown. But he keeps on persevering. He moves to Springfield, Ohio, or Massachusetts, which was a hotbed of abolitionist activity. So he met a bunch of people that wanted to do the same sort of stuff that he did. He met with big name abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth. And while he was in Springfield, he came up with this idea of a militant counterpart to the Underground Railroad called the Subterranean Passway. So instead of just passively helping people escape, he says, why don't we go and free them ourselves? Like let's be active here. Let's use violence to achieve our goals, which is insanely radical for the time. It's already radical to be an abolitionist during this time, but to say let's use the threat of violence to get it done, that's wild. And that's also why a bunch of people are saying John Brown is totally crazy. So John Brown eventually he enters our story in Kansas territory in 1855. He joins his 5 sons here. They write to him and they say, "Dad, things are not good here. There's a lot of tension, and I think the pro-slavery and anti-slavery sides we're gonna clash." So foreseeing this problem, John Brown comes to Kansas with a wagon full of weapons and ammunition and swords. Um, he stays with his half sister, Florilla Adair, and their cabin. You can visit that real cabin. It's the John Brown State Historic Site in Osawatomie, Kansas. I recommend you go see it. You can literally go inside this cabin, which is pretty cool. Um, So fast forward a little bit, 1856, a giant pro-slavery mob comes into the city of Lawrence, Kansas, um, and burns it to the ground. Lawrence was an abolitionist town. The pro-slavery people didn't like what they were saying, so they basically burned the city. Um, like a day or two after this happens, on the floor of the Senate, we have a Southern Senator, Preston Brooks, beat Charles Sumner, a Northern politician, with his cane on the floor of the Senate. So, I mean, this is brutal. This is hardcore. He beats Charles Sumner so brutally that he can't resume work in the Senate for like a couple years. So, John Brown sees or really hears about Lawrence being burned to the ground, and then he learns about our elected officials beating each other on the floor of the Senate. So the people that are supposed to be in charge of the government have basically thrown the gloves off, and it's a free for all. So he's done at this point. He is furious. So he says, quote, something must be done to show these barbarians that we too have rights. And as you can see on some of these pictures here, he absolutely did something. He proposed a secret mission, a radical retaliatory measure that would involve some killing. So this is the Potawatomi Massacre. This is what John Brown is known for the most in Kansas. Essentially, him and a couple of his sons went house to house in the middle of the night, basically knocking on doors saying, hey, have you threatened free state settlers? How did you vote in the election? Do you have pro-slavery sympathies? And if they didn't like the answer, then he would drag them from their homes and then instruct his sons to hack them to death with these artillery broadswords. And that's not the actual sword they use, but it's the same exact model. Brutal stuff. I mean, this looks like a Roman gladius. So up until this time, only like a couple people had died in Kansas territory due to political violence. John Brown and his sons kill five in a single night. So this like explodes the territory into the most violent period that Bleeding Kansas has. So people do not like this, obviously. This is extreme. And it results in more violence. Imagine that, right? Violence leading to more violence. So some people hear about what John Brown's doing, and a deputy U.S. Marshal, Henry C. Pate, this guy here, who, interestingly enough, helped burn Lawrence to the ground. So you have a U.S. Marshal participating in this, which is crazy. But he gets men to seek revenge. He captures two of John Brown's sons, John Jr. and Jason, and they fight for 3 hours on this battlefield here, the Battle of Blackjack. Um, and if you think about it, these are anti-slavery and pro-slavery people engaging at the same time on US soil. So really you can think of this as an unofficial start of the American Civil War. Eventually, it's a success for John Brown. They kind of bluff their way into winning, and people still are not quite done with John Brown. So a group of Missourians come with 250 men to John Brown's town of Osawatomie. They unfortunately meet one of John Brown's sons on the road. They ask him who he is. They shoot him. Um, that's the end of that. So John Brown gets like 40 men to try to go up against 250. There's no way it's going to work. He does buy time for the residents of Osawatomie to escape, but they burn the whole city to the ground. City is generous. It's a bunch of log cabins. But regardless, this is a loss for John Brown. But this catapults him to the national spotlight. So like this guy starts appearing in newspapers. They're calling him Osawatomie Brown. So people are knowing about this. John Brown leaves Kansas. Everybody wants him dead. So he leaves Kansas to go raise money for his grand plan, which we are going to talk about very soon. He briefly comes back to Kansas to throw people off his trail. He goes into Missouri, liberates an enslaved family, and gets about 11 people, takes them all the way up to Chicago, I believe, so that they can go across the lake and get to Canada to get their freedom. So this is what everybody knows John Brown for. Harpers Ferry. We're gonna speed run this because it's pretty crazy. But John Brown, his ultimate goal is to raid the federal arsenal at Harpers Ferry. So this arsenal has about 100,000 muskets and rifles. How John Brown planned to take 100,000 muskets and rifles with 21 men, we don't know. He doesn't. He probably didn't know either. So most people said that he talked to this plan about. He essentially wanted to take these weapons and give them to enslaved people and go from plantation to plantation, basically freeing all the enslaved people. When he proposed this pitch, people said, that's not going to work. Like, have you talked to any people about this? Have you told them that this is your plan? Like, they're not just going to come to you. Um, but at this point, I believe that John Brown kind of made up his mind and said, listen, if I succeed, I succeed. If I fail, I kind of succeed because I make myself into the symbolic figure of trying to free the slaves. So somehow, wildly, they go into Harper's Ferry with like almost no resistance. They meet one unarmed guard, they take him hostage. Um, Everything's looking up, but things get worse. So they don't get out in time. So people start showing up to work, and by the morning, the governor of Virginia, the secretary of war, and the president know that this like group of 20 guys has taken a federal arsenal hostage. Eventually, they're forced to retreat into this engine house here, and by noon of the next day, there's no hope for escape. John Brown just waited way too long because he thought that people would come to his cause, but he didn't really talk to anybody about it. so so they didn't. And again, even if they did, how are they going to transport 100,000 weapons with less than 2 dozen guys? So eventually they break down the doors, they take John Brown hostage, and um, since he doesn't die in this, he gets to write letters and meet with people all the way into his execution day. So this is really truly what made John Brown the figure that we know today. Is he didn't just die in that raid. He still got to write stuff. And this court appearance was telegraphed all over the nation. So people were following this because they're like, well, when's the next John Brown going to happen? So Southern slave owners were freaking out because they're like, this guy just came into the South and tried to start a slave insurrection. When's this going to happen again? So the day that John Brown is set to be executed, he's convicted of treason and murder and starting a slave insurrection. But he says his famous last words, and he handed this to his jailer, and thankfully he kept it and preserved it. But he said, I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will not be purged away, but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done. So John Brown sees the writing on the wall. The only way slavery is going to go away is with the Civil War. He rides to his execution sitting on the coffin that he's going to be buried in. He walks the steps of the gallows. There are hundreds of guards around because they think they're spring an escape plan. John Brown says, "No, don't try to rescue me. I'm worth so much more dead than alive." And he's hanged for treason. Um, Not too long after that, about 2 years, Kansas becomes a state. And we only become a state after enough southern states had seceded from the Union for the vote to pass. And then, as we know, a couple months after Kansas becomes a state, Fort Sumter is fired upon and the Civil War breaks out. So all throughout the Civil War, soldiers are marching to John Brown's body, a song. So like John Brown literally becomes this larger than life figure that you can see painted on the walls of the Capitol. Now, John Stewart Curry's bearded, screaming 10-foot tall John Brown contrasts a little bit with this guy here. And for the very majority of his life, it was stern, clean shaven, generic John Brown. And if we had a little bit more time, we could really dive into how historians have interpreted this guy. But hopefully, this speed run through John Brown's life and career gives you a little bit more idea of who this guy was, what made him tick, and why we're still talking about him today. So I think we have a few minutes for some questions, and I would love to answer any that we have.
Yeah, there's some great questions coming in. So the first one here is, do other states view John Brown as a hero like Kansas does?
Great call. No. And even Kansans, there's a lot of Kansans that don't necessarily think of John Brown as a heroic figure. And really, you can kind of think of it as a sliding scale from like hero on one end and terrorist on the other. Um, and really, I mean, if you look at Pottawatomie Creek, he said his goal was to strike terror into the hearts of pro-slavery people. So by his own admission, he's kind of acting as a terrorist there, but he's doing good things. So it raises this question, do the ends justify the means? Um, I won't answer that question here today, but I think I know how John Brown would answer it. And he would say yes.
So a lot of questions coming in about, did John Brown, do we know anything about his family? Did he have brothers and sisters? Did anybody help him? Or was
Yeah.
this kind of his own passion?
So yeah, a lot. Like I said, he had a ton of children, and many of his sons followed his cause. He stayed with his half sister in Osawatomie, and she also was not very happy that especially after the Potawatomi massacre, she was like, "What? And now you're gonna stay at my home." Um, so yeah, he had some siblings, and a few of his sons did die fighting with him. But the others survived and went off. Most went to California, and his wife did as well afterwards, and they lived for a pretty long period of time. But yeah, he did have a lot of support with his family.
And then a lot of questions coming in about the term abolitionist, and
Yeah,
like they just kind of want to know a little more about that.
sure thing. So yeah, abolitionist, it has that word abolish, get rid of. So an abolitionist is someone who wants to get rid of slavery. And today you would think like most people would be abolitionists, right? Because slavery is awful. But back in the day, in John Brown's time, very few people would be willing to admit that they were an abolitionist. So to put this into perspective, all the people that came to Kansas, like 3% of those were abolitionists. So the fact that John Brown was an abolitionist who also engaged in violence to bring about an end of slavery is wild. Very few people did that, and which makes him the figure that he is today.
Yeah, and then to wrap up, once again, thank you so much for being here with us today, Trey. They are interested in what you're doing a little bit as far as, at the Kansas Historical Society, how you got into that role
Yeah.
and yeah.
Yeah, so I always loved history as a kid. I was that kid in history class. Um, I went to school for it, and I didn't know if I really wanted to be a classroom teacher, but I loved talking about history, so I found my way into museums. And I've been doing this for about 7 years or so, and I love trying to make Kansas history as cool as possible. So it's, picking out the explosions and the violence and the all of that stuff, the gross stuff too, the weird stuff, because that's what sticks in people's heads. So our museum, the Kansas Museum of History, is the State Museum of Kansas, and we are doing a whole renovation right now, but we will be open later this year. So you'll have to come visit with your families or with your schools to see the brand new State Museum of Kansas, and it's going to be awesome. You won't be disappointed.
Hey, Trey, we want to thank you so much for being here with us today, and everybody with us on the adventure. We hope you have a great day, and we'll see you at the next one. Bye,
Awesome. Thank
y'all.
you all so much. Have a good Kansas day.